Okay, so we might kick off, guys. My name is Jess and I'm part of the RAID network as an event coordinator. I'm joined today by my two other event representatives, Kayla and Belinda. And today we wanted to start our Spotlight On series for Southeast Asia. This is going to be one of probably 4 or 5 different webinars focusing on different countries. And what we hope to achieve today is some networking opportunities, listening to some great speakers and expanding your network and maybe learning a little bit more about Southeast Asian countries. So I would like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all meet on today. And I'd like to pay my respects to the elders and past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to the Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islander people here today. So I'm sure that everyone on this webinar today already knows about RAID, but for those who are new, RAID is Researchers in Agriculture for International Development, and we're an organisation who are looking to build the capacity of international ag research for development within Australia, particularly focusing on mid-career and early career researchers. We want to create career pathways, particularly in the international ag space. We want to strengthen opportunities for these people to network. And so I know that it's really difficult sometimes when you're trying to break into the ag sector and you don't really know who to talk to or where to go. And we hope that RAID provides some opportunities just to give you a little bit of direction. RAID's also supported by ACIAR, so the Australian Centre for International Ag Research, and the Crawford Fund. And these are 2 great companies that really support international ag research and building the capacity of early to mid-career researchers. And so what is the Spotlight On series? We're looking at trying to focus on building capacity in different areas of the globe and looking at current research as what's happening in these areas. So today, Southeast Asia, we're going to be talking about some of the great research that 2 of our presenters have done in these areas, and also some of the challenges and development opportunities that are presented here in these countries. We want to learn a little bit more about the culture and then connect also with like-minded people who are interested in working in Southeast Asia. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nora Devoe, who is a research program manager for Forestry's research at ACIAR. And Nora, I might just stop sharing and you can share your screen. You're just on mute there too, Nora, sorry.
Sorry.
There we go.
Okay, so who do we have? I'm just trying to get a sense of who's here. So hi, as Jess said, I'm Nora Devoe. I'm the Forestry Research Program Manager at ACIAR. I'll start sharing my screen.
Sorry as well, I just forgot to mention that we'll, if you have any questions for Nora, please pop them in the chat and we'll answer all the questions after Nora and Franny have started speaking.
I don't know what's happening here.
Perfect, we can see that one there, Nora.
Yeah, that's not the first one. There we go. Okay, so the topic I was given was challenges and highlights working in Southeast Asia. I think challenges and highlights is really a very personal perspective. My perspective on the topic is shaped very much by the tasks that I am asked by my employer to complete. My profession, I'm a forester, and of course, the particular countries and communities where I'm working. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about each of those things. The photo shows the Mekong River in northern Laos near Luang Prabang, and you can see that the image is a bit murky, and that's because it's taken in the dry season and farmers burn their fields. I see everything through an environmental lens, so trying to get my slide to advance? Not happening. I don't know why my slide isn't moving.
Does it work on
Okay.
the arrows
So
on the keyboard?
I got it.
Yep.
Yeah, I got it. So my employer is the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, or ACIAR. I know that a lot of people in RAID are familiar with ACIAR, but just in case you're not, I'll give you a few quick key points. We're a statutory authority. We've been around since 1982. So an agency of the Commonwealth Government in the Foreign Affairs portfolio. ACIAR has 10 research programs, and so mainstream ag programs like livestock, crops, horticulture, soil, water. And then there are a few sort of agriculture a bit broader, like fisheries, climate change. Who did I leave out? Social sciences. So I'm the forestry research program manager. My portfolio is about $6 million per annum on commissioned research projects, and they're in 14 countries. So this is what I'm trying to do with the funds. ACIAR's mandate is to reduce poverty and strengthen livelihoods. And this, I don't know if you can see the pointer, this is our modality. This is how we're supposed to get it done. Collaborative international research. Just a little bit more detail. We have 6 objectives. Food security and poverty reduction. This is a shorthand for sustainable management of natural resources, and that's where that climate change in portfolio comes in. Human nutrition, promotion of gender equity, empowerment of women and girls. This is a very big focus in DFAT, Foreign Affairs and Trade. More exclusive agri-food and forestry market chains. That's about trying to enhance values all the way along the chain and to sheet the values back to the producer. And in our case, we're very focused on smallholder farmers. And last but not least, building scientific and policy capabilities in the partner countries so that people can build healthy societies and strong economies on their own. So I said our research is our modality, research for development. In ACIAR, we consider research is generation of new knowledge. Because my training is in biophysical sciences, I think of it as a very structured learning process, a scientific method. The forestry portfolio, forestry looks like it's about science on the surface, but actually it's about people. So the social and cultural and economic dimensions are really important, and there are a whole lot of research techniques and approaches that are in the portfolio. Mostly it's participatory action research. So we're trying to use science to drive development. And for me, development is effectively, can be summarized as social change. People have more money, they have more security, they have more options. We want science. Our founding legislation requires us to do science, but we evaluate our projects, our research projects, based on their development outcomes. So first you have to have valid science, and then you have to make it serve people. And that sometimes it's a tall order. So I'm a forester, so my perspective is very focused in trees. And it goes from single important trees to, this is an agroforestry planting here, and you can see it's quite a steep landscape. This is in northern Vietnam. A lot of emphasis on woodlots. This is a very, like a small plantation. I think this is also in Vietnam, it's acacia. And then this block is a natural forest, a dipterocarp forest. That one's actually in Indonesia. In Australia, forestry is often very narrowly defined and to be focused in plantations and this box. But for most of the rest of the world, forestry is much more about natural forests and the great diversity of products and services that they provide. In Southeast Asia, there have been in the past very many ACIAR projects that are focused here, and they've been highly successful at increasing rural incomes where, farmers plant small woodlots. There's a strong market, it's pulpwood, and it's worked quite well. But for me, the forestry departments that I work with know how to do plantations. Where they need the technical assistance is in the other three boxes, especially natural forests. Deforestation and forest degradation have created a huge demand for skills in forest restoration. So restoration is really the current focus of the forestry program. So let me tell you a little bit about our work in Laos. I think of the Lao program as the 4 Ps, and this one is the first P. It's about production. Here's a scientist in a lab at the Northern Forestry Ag and Research College in Northern Laos, and she's working in a tissue culture lab that ACIAR built in an early project and has continued to add on to, and the stuff in the jars are teak clones. So they're all genetically identical, which enables all sorts of research around breeding and productivity. So they've gone from being produced in a lab to being planted out. The middle box is it's a teak spacing trial. And you can sort of see that in the foreground, the big trees are more widely spaced than the stuff in the background, which is much smaller and closely spaced. Hello, guess what? If you put them close together, they don't grow as fast. It's not all that hard to grasp, I think. And then the last box, these are actually fruit trees, and I think this photo's in Vietnam as well. So while most people think of forestry as wood, and that's really important, there are a whole lot of other products that we're also producing in agroforestry systems. The second P is about processing, and this has really been a tremendous story in Laos. ACIAR has invested in timber processing in Laos, I think about 12 years now, and it went from something like this first box where, it was a little two-man rig, and the product is just sold by the roadside. And we built a wood technology research lab at the National University of Laos, which enabled a whole lot of development in the sector. And it's basically moved all the way across to here. And the people in the picture are graduates of the National University of Laos Wood Technology Program. And they are standing in a new that has basically come on the back of the research done at the National University of Laos. So by building and progressing this program over a period of years, we've actually created a new industrial sector in Laos. And the other thing to notice in this photo, you can see quite a few of those people are women. And women are not well represented in manufacturing jobs in Southeast Asia, and women are not well represented in timber processing anywhere. If you go to a sawmill in Australia, you won't find very many women, but they are the preferred employees in this sawmill. And I find that really interesting and really gratifying. We have some social research around labor market participation, trying to understand why that's worked so well in Laos. And I'm now trying to duplicate it in a sort of a related project in Fiji. We'll see how that works in Melanesia. So that's the second P, processing. The third P is protection. And this is Dr. Madeleine Healy. Some of you may know her because she's been in RAID. She was studying the eucalyptus gall wasp in Laos, and that's what's going on there. They're examining eucs to see who's infected. We also have disease or pathogen related research. This picture shows it's a fungal pathogen called ceratocystis. It's on an acacia tree. The object of the protection program is to obviously conserve planted forest assets that are needed to feed that huge sawmill that I just showed you. But many of the pathogens have broad host ranges, so that this ceratocystis also infects some horticultural crops. So this basic research is trying to keep the resource base secure, in fact. The fourth P is policy, and that's kind of a hard thing to illustrate. I could show you lots of pictures of people sitting around in meetings. It's not very visually exciting, but it has been very effective at assisting the government to design its policies to encourage the growth of the sector, and also to look at Laos has a big issue with conflicting land uses where smallholders have usufruct on the same pieces of land that are subject to other developments. And so some of the policies been aimed at securing smallholder land rights. So that's where the program in Laos has been focused. And moving into new projects, we've got a couple of new projects that we're just working on commissioning now, and they are in this area of forest restoration. Trying to go from, this is actually cyclone damage in this photo, trying to go from situations where forests have been lost for any number of reasons to situations where there's a well-established biodiverse productive forest. It's a pretty big need globally, as I said earlier. This photo is in here to make a point about non-timber forest products. About 2/3 of the Lao population relies, at least in some part, on forests for food, fuel, fiber, medicines, a huge suite of products. And what I'm talking about here is direct dependence. So people who go into a forest to get something that they then process themselves rather than, heading over to the shop to get it. And what you can see in this picture, there's a whole bunch of forest products. There's some fiber at the left there, split bamboo, which is an important building material. You can see there's some milled timber involved in the door, some basic furniture. And the woman is using an interesting forest product. It's called broom grass, Thysanoptera, and she's making brooms for sale. A really interesting piece of economic research around the broom grass has shown that in 3 provinces, that grass generates more income than cattle production, which I was shocked when I was told that, because cattle are pretty valuable items. So the restoration, the new work is aimed at contributing to the global knowledge of forest dynamics and restoration. We already know that the only things that will result in enduring forest are things that benefit local people. And so we think we can learn something about ensuring that all that non-timber forest product remains available and accessible to Lao people. So let me move along and talk now just for a minute about challenges. Again, this is very much a personal perspective. For me, a major challenge are environmental trends. Laos is almost entirely a natural forest climax. So that means biophysically, the condition engenders the growth of forests. But deforestation has really been precipitous. I think forest cover was about 72% in the 60s, and then it fell during the war years drastically to about 47% by 1992, and current estimates are about 40% of forest cover. illegal harvesting is a big driver. Shifting cultivation, commercial ag expansion, forest plantations, mining. And this picture is about hydropower, which has been a big driver of deforestation. This is just above a dam on the Mekong River, quite a controversial dam, the Xayaburi Dam. Just to digress for a second, this map shows the Mekong River rising in China and coming through Laos. And this spot, Luang Prabang, that's the first slide that I showed you. It's a development site for a dam. And you can see that there are dams all the way along the Mekong. Laos has 79 dams, I think, on the Mekong now, and they're aiming for 100. So environmental trends, there are a lot of big vested interests, and that's certainly a challenge. If you're going to work effectively in development, you have to have a meeting of minds and a shared vision, shared goals, and that rests on communication. So COVID has been a huge challenge for me. Without the face-to-face and being able to get out on the ground, it's hard to develop strong projects, especially in cultures like Laos, where people are a little bit reluctant to speak their minds directly, and you have to, it's a bit of an art to figure out what the real priorities are. And then finally, for me, again, the research for development modality is pretty challenging. I've been a research scientist, and I've also worked in development agencies. And I find the combination, when you get it right, it's really powerful because science has that power of generalizability that lets you learn something that you can then broadly apply. But development is very context specific. So I think it's a fine art to combine those things effectively. The highlights, of course, are the project successes, and we've had quite a few. I've mentioned a few along the way: the wood processing, the fact that we've created a big new industrial sector that's employing quite a lot of people, especially women. We've provided a lot of fundamental knowledge about forests, plantations, forest products, forest pests. Through the combination of those projects, we've really built something, and that's been gratifying. The fact that we've built that processing sector, it has a very strong positive feedback to sustainable resource management, and that's also been very gratifying. And I think for anyone who works internationally or cross-culturally, friendships are really the thing that enriches people. This is a Hmong lady in the far north who's working on the agroforestry project you can just see in the background. So I'm probably over time, so I better just stop there. I'll stop sharing. Okay, back to you, Jess.
Thanks, Nora. That was really eye-opening, actually. I haven't had much experience in the forestry sector, and it is such a large industry, particularly in Southeast Asia. So that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
I might ask everyone, if you have questions for Nora, we'll just leave them to the end of Franny's presentation. So I would like to introduce Franny Earp, who is a gender consultant and a doubles master's student. So she's completing 2 masters at once. And she's just been accepted to do her PhD at JCU looking at gender development research. So Fran, if you wanted to share your screen, we'll jump straight in.
Perfect, thank you. So can you all see my screen there? There you go.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Fran.
Perfect. Okay, so thanks so much for having me today. This is probably one of my favorite things to talk about. So there's a likelihood that I'll run over time. So just feel free to flag me and tell me to stop talking if I get to that point. But today I really want to talk quite personally about my experience working in Laos as a practitioner. As Jess mentioned, I've worked in development in a couple of different forms. So I've worked in academia, gendered consultancy, policy, and then practice as well. And I think that there's a really interesting interface between those different areas of development. And sometimes you can be lucky enough, like me, to really enjoy all different facets of that type of work. But there's also people that are much more suited to academia within development rather than the practice side. And so today I really want to talk about some of the highs of working in practice, but also some of the challenges, because I think that's sometimes something we forget to discuss. And that's a really important part of understanding what it is to be a practitioner working in development. So to start off, I'll just tell you a little bit more about myself. So I was a Sydney student. My family's originally from England, and we moved to Australia when I was younger. And I had no agricultural connection prior to going to university. In fact, when I was deciding what I was going to do at university, I wasn't really too sure. I knew I was interested in animals, but more interestingly, I was interested between people's connections with animals. So for example, farmers' connections with their livestock and how that works. So I decided to do my Bachelor of Animal and Veterinary Bioscience at the University of Sydney. And during that time, we had to choose a couple of different placements to do during the course. And one of the placements I decided to do was to go to South Africa and work at a great white shark research centre. And that's really where I thought I'd found my passion. I was so set on working with sharks. After that placement, I got offered a job to return back to South Africa after I had finished my degree. And I was pretty certain that's what I was going to do. So certain, in fact, I got a tattoo of a shark because I just decided that was my passion. That's where I was going to work. And then it got to the honours year of my degree. And there was an honours project going to go to Laos and to go and work there. And to be honest, at that point, I sort of thought that might just be an interesting honours project to do. I'm interested in travel and working globally, as I was going to South Africa for that placement. And so that's the real reason that I took that honours project. So I went to Laos in June of 2018 for my honours project. And the way that my honours year worked was I ran my first semester in Australia, and I sort of looked at my literature review and understanding the work I was going to do. And then I went over to Laos. And I think it first happened, my first aha moment that maybe development was the space for me was when I was writing my literature review. And the reason that that happened was I remember having this moment where I thought, one of the world's biggest problems is hunger, and the way to fix that is food security. And then the way to fix food security is working with people and understanding how they can work with their agriculture to improve food supply. And I remember going to my supervisors like, whoa, this is what agricultural development means. Like, we can fix really big global issues in this area, to which they answered, yeah, we know. That's why we're in this space too. But that's sort of where I first found my real interest for ag development. And so then I went over to Laos, and I really enjoyed it while I was in country, and I really enjoyed meeting people, working in the space, but I also found it challenging. And I think in some ways that challenge is what really continued to drive me in the space, and that's something we'll discuss a little bit later on. So specifically in that honours project, I was conducting a cost-benefit analysis of foot and mouth disease control. And I was collaborating with an ACIAR funded project in Laos. And so that was, it's called an 067 project, when we talk later about the two different projects I ended up working on. And that focused specifically on disease control within livestock. So then what happened when I was in country, as I mentioned before, I really started to learn some of the challenges of working in the field. During my time being there just in my honours project, we were hit by a tropical storm. So that photo is me trying to get across some, that previously was not a river, that's just a road, but that's it full of water. And that's me trying to get across to one of our village sites. I was also in Laos at the time of the Champasak dam collapse. So as Nora mentioned, there are a lot of dams in Laos, and unfortunately one of them actually collapsed while I was there, which was a very significant event in Laos and very scary event as well. I also got food poisoning while I was there many times, something I will become accustomed to as I continue to work more in the field. And I also began to realize the delays in field work. So things just happened so much slower for a whole different cause of reasons. But I was really learning to understand that that's how that works in agricultural development. So I came home from my honours project, and I was asked if I wanted to go back and work on that project full time once I submitted my honours thesis. So one of the Lao core members had left the job, and the project was only supposed to go for a couple more months. So I sort of said I'd go along and I'd continue work on that project until it finished. In the end, we got a project extension. So I ended up living in Laos for 1.5 years. And so that's sort of what I'll discuss with you now. So I moved in November 2018. It was just a couple of days after I submitted my honours thesis. So it was a pretty big entry into the real world after doing my degree. Some of the challenges that I originally found were just the idea of like finding where you're going to live. Like I'd been to Laos before for a month or so, but I hadn't ever been there with the concept of living there. So I found this small 1-bedroom apartment, which was actually below ground level. So every time it rained, the sewage system of the whole province came up through my toilet. So I spent a lot of time bucketing things out of that first house, which wasn't that enjoyable, but it was a really good entry into some of those challenges I was discussing before. I met my core team. And then I also started reviewing the project. So as I mentioned before, there was that 067 project, which I was familiar with because of my honours project. And that was looking at disease control, village biosecurity programs. And that was based in 3 provinces in Laos. So that was in Luang Prabang, which is also where I was lived and based, Ziang Quang and Xayaburi. And then the other project was an 068 project. So this was something I wasn't familiar with during my honours year. And this was looking more at improving beef value chain competitivity and looking at market values of cattle. And that was based in the same 3 provinces, but it was also in Savannakhet as well. And while those provinces might look quite close on a map, when you're driving to each of them, they can take a long time. So Luang Prabang to Ziang Quang took us 14 hours in the car. To Xayaburi was only 3, and then down to Savannakhet was a 2-day trip with a stopover in Vientiane. So it was pretty long days just getting out to the field sites, and I usually went at least once a month to each of the field sites, often more than that within that time. So then what did working in the field look like for me? In the beginning, working in the field really just meant surveys. And in the beginning, I think I was almost disappointed by that fact. I thought I was going to be out there like getting in with livestock, but actually now I'm so passionate about surveys, and I really learned to understand there's so much you can learn from just speaking directly to farmers. And some of the real lessons I learned were female farmer participation surveys, which is something I'll discuss a bit later on, but also a lot about survey design and survey training. So the idea that just because a survey might work in an Australian setting doesn't necessarily mean that's going to work in a Laos setting for a whole different factor of issues. So for example, in the beginning, I was really quick to make sure things went as quickly as possible. And then I soon realized that in Laos, you have to sit with the farmers when you conduct a survey, have lunch with them, might go out to look at their livestock. So things are going to take longer than they would in an Australian setting. But you actually learn a lot from those observations of those different cultural activities as well. So it's really learning to take a step back from what I considered to be survey experiences in Australia, and then changing that and fitting with the team and their suggestions. And then another big suggestion on that, and something that I'll continue to discuss with you today, is the idea that you learn from your mistakes. So very early on, I was told you have to take merchandise to the farmers every time you go and conduct a survey. And in the beginning, I thought, oh, we don't need to do that. And I quickly had farmers coming up to me being like, where's my hat? Where's my t-shirt? Because it just sort of created this collaboration that they provided some really interesting survey information to us. And then we also provided something to them. And it was also a way for them to reflect, hey, I'm part of this project, and a really exciting thing for them. So I quickly learned that I did need to provide things, ended up providing a lot of hats, those blue hats that you can see in those photos there. We had a lot of hats going out in my 1.5 years of being in Laos. I also made the purple t-shirts up in the top, which maybe didn't go down as well. I learned purple wasn't a color to put on a t-shirt, but all those sorts of things, I just learned that that's something that I hadn't necessarily gone into Laos thinking was a really important part of survey design, and yet it proved to be the case. I eventually then did get more into the livestock handling. So we did a lot of swabbing of buffalo in particular to test for foot and mouth disease presence. But I also had to learn to do things differently to what I had. So I was my first year out of university, and I was used to, in your university, you might only ever bleed a cow 1 or 2 times. And then suddenly in Laos, you're teaching government staff how to do that. So that was a really big challenge for me in itself, particularly the fact that it looked very different to how it did at my university farm. So we didn't have cattle crushers. So in this image here, you can see we're using a bleeding pole. There was also minimal PPE. So I wore my steel cap boots, but a lot of people just wore flip-flops or no shoes at all. So that was really interesting for me, of learning where do I push the line and say that we might change safety requirements and things like that in the field. And also I didn't have any internet connection. So I spent a lot of time watching YouTube videos, learning how to do things before I get to the field. And then I'd get to the field and just sort of hope for the best and roll with the challenges as they came through. This is just a little example of me setting up, I don't know if this will play for us, setting up blood analysis in a little hotel that I was staying in the field. So it shows you how quickly you have to adapt to these things and make changes as you go. Let's change to the next slide. I also quickly learned that I had to build networks and partnerships. So in a professional sense, I joined forces with the Laos Buffalo Dairy, which is a social enterprise based in Luang Prabang. And we really only met through our own networks. I met Susie, who's the founder of the dairy, via an expat community. And then we sort of realized that we could work with each other to really ensure that we were providing the best for our teams and our project sites. So in exchange for me training her buffalo staff in working with the community and in agricultural development, that her staff trained my team on how to milk buffaloes. So we were sort of able to work together and provide things for one another. And I think that's a really beautiful thing that I'm continuing to learn about development, that the people you meet in development, you will continue to work with. It's not a very big space. And so it's really nice to be able to build on each other's projects rather than competing against each other for grants. You also have to build networks and partnerships and friendships. So I was quite lonely in the beginning of being in Laos, particularly traveling to the field so regularly. It was hard to meet new people, but eventually I did make some really lovely friends that worked in all different aspects of development in the country. And that's a really important thing that I would push to anyone that wants to live overseas and work in country. You have to go really hard at making friends in the beginning and really push to that, because otherwise you can sort of lose track of building that social life in the country you're working in as well. And the same is true with working with my team. In the beginning, I was considered as a bit of an outsider of the team. I didn't speak any Lao and my core team didn't speak any English. And so we really had to work together and build a trust and a sense of community, which we really did achieve by the end, which is probably one of my biggest achievements of the whole time that I was there. And in the end, I had things like being invited to team members' weddings, as you can see in that photo, which was a really nice element of being part of that Lao community. And also working with the universities. So I went and taught at 2 of the universities in Laos. I ran 3 workshops over 6 months period at each of the universities. And that was really significant too, because that sort of built those new grads of those universities into the programs that we were running and ensuring that we could collaborate within one another, which was really excellent part of the program. But this sort of leads me to one of my interests in practitioner relations and working in the field. And this is actually something I'm writing a paper on at the moment. And it's this interest when, and I felt this strongly being in Laos, that I wasn't necessarily part of the Lao team, because as long as I would work and live in Laos, I was never going to become Lao. I was always going to be an outsider from that team. But I was also an outsider from the Sydney team, because I wasn't necessarily experiencing the same things of the project as they were from Sydney. So it creates this interface where practitioners sort of experience things a little bit differently. I notice I'm probably running a bit over time, am I, Jess? I'll
You're all right, friend. Keep going.
Okay, cool. So one of the quotes I've got from a different development practitioner who also works in the field with it while I'm writing this paper summed it up really nicely. And she's speaking here about Indonesia, but she said, I spoke the language, I had local friends, I spent the evening playing cards with an older neighbour and would go with my local family to church every Sunday. I was finally part of the team, but also I was and always would be an outsider. So I think that's a really important part of working in country that sometimes isn't always discussed. And then finally, I'll wrap myself up here. But female farmer empowerment was something that really stood out to me working in the field, particularly in those surveys. When you're in country, you can see the experience of females and whether they're participating, which was something you couldn't necessarily see from an outsider's perspective, because I could understand the cultural factors that determined female participation. And that's something that now really drives me forward. So currently I'm just in the process of writing up my thesis for my Masters of Global Development that I'm conducting at James Cook University. And in that, I'm purposely looking at Asian academic scholarship of Asian region feminists, because I think that there's sort of this misunderstanding that we can put Western feminist ideals into development female empowerment projects and hope that they'll stick everywhere. But of course, because of different cultural and contextual factors, that's not the case. So this sort of has stuck with me, and something that's changed my life out of that time in Laos. I now work exclusively in gender, and that's something I'm really passionate about. So as Jess mentioned, I'll also then be continuing that research on at a PhD at James Cook University next year. And I'll leave you there because otherwise I could keep talking forever. But yes, looking forward to hearing any questions as well.
Thanks, Fran. I know once we get you started on gender development, we'll be here all afternoon.
Yeah, you'll all have to hang up on me. I'll keep talking.
That was fantastic, Franny, and it really gave insight onto some of the challenges and highlights of working in countries like Laos and how you overcame those. If anyone has any questions for Nora or Fran, shoot them through. But I might start one with you, Nora. You mentioned that communication is top priority in trying to understand what the farmers want and need from your research projects, and now with COVID that's taken that face-to-face away, what are some of the actions you're putting in place, and how do you overcome trying to contact your farmers in Laos now that we can't really go overseas at the moment?
Well, we're doing a lot of remote communication with people who are, government officials and in company offices. Getting out to smallholder farmers is a different challenge. We do have remote communication on various projects that are people using their mobile phones on WhatsApp and so on. And that works well for some people in some situations, but what's really happened in ACIAR is a shift from the Australians being on the ground to the Australians being in the background as mentors and advisors and using local partners a whole lot more. And that's really been interesting for us because I've learned some things about capabilities that I didn't know were there, because our partners, they weren't carrying as much of the load in the past. I think it's really great that some of that responsibility and leadership has been transferred, and also because they're insiders. In some ways, I think it's really strengthened projects. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really great way of looking at it, and like you said, connecting with people that normally you might not have within your project. So thanks, Nora. We did have, while we've got Nora, we did have Mohammed asked about research on aquaculture. And Belinda has popped a link into the chat there, Mohammed, about the different projects in ACIAR that focus on aquaculture. But Nora, did you know of any projects currently happening in Southeast Asia focused on aquaculture?
Yeah, well, they're not in my portfolio. They're in the fisheries portfolio, which is quite large. Fisheries has numerous projects in Laos. Some of them are focused on that dam building and fish passages to mitigate negative effects on the fish protein is a critical food resource for smallholders. There aren't any aquaculture projects in Laos that I know of, but there are numerous aquaculture projects in other countries. So the best person to talk to that would really be the fisheries RPM.
Thanks, Nora. Anika, actually going back to the COVID, talking about communication with COVID, Anika's just asking about how it will change for research for development in the future. Is this going to be an ongoing issue? Do you think that we are, stuck mostly at our local country and not being able to get us overseas as frequently? Do you think that this is going to be a normal thing that we're going to have to deal with now? And yeah, what will the future look like for communication and doing research for development projects?
I really love my field work, so it's been very hard for me to accept that the COVID restrictions are a long-term and maybe beyond condition. And I think the answer is yes, it's going to change the way, certainly the way ACIAR operates. Again, a lot more emphasis on building partnerships, effective research partnerships that can execute the work with support remotely. A lot of the mentoring is around the science project, experimental design and statistical analysis and structuring the effort. But we do have good longstanding local research partnerships, and we're relying on them more and more.
Also, Jess, if I could speak to that question too, I think
Fun.
it's interesting, and it's a hard position. I'm the same as Nora, that I love working in the field. It's my favorite thing to do, and I can't wait to get back. But I also think the more I work in, so now I'm researching in a global development perspective, coming off that agricultural perspective. And I find that I think more and more I realize that in development, I would basically like to work towards my retirement. If I could retire early because there was food security, or because there's local partners that are able to work within that space and don't require sort of this Western colonial, sometimes development movement that we push, I would be so happy to do that, as sad as it would be that I couldn't work in the field. And so I think COVID is really nice that maybe this is a beginning of a push that we have to move into that changing gear in localizing development earlier than we had originally intended to, which, as unfortunate as it is, because I'd love to be overseas, it is probably a really good thing for us to be working out these new ways of doing things.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it, Fran, and yeah, maybe it's empowering more local, NGOs to take up some of the places that we were previously involved in. So that's really positive way of looking at, we all love to travel and be in country. Boss Borry, did you have your hand up? Would you like to come onto the mic and talk a question?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just want to sort of add on to what Nora and Frank have said in terms of partnerships. And just to support that, I can attest to having the national partners as a very valuable and powerful tool, because they in turn go into getting the agricultural extension officers who know what buttons to press and where to press them and what to and when to press them actually. So this is very valuable and shows, it just exemplifies, partnerships for the goals. So yep, I can attest to that. Thank you.
To that comment. And if anyone else wants to jump on and feel free to jump in and jump on the mic. But I have a question here for Fran. When you said you were talking about how you didn't know much Laos when you came to Laos, and you found that was a bit of a barrier. How did you begin to break down that barrier and not assert yourself, but integrate into the community and adjust from that culture shock when you first got into Laos?
Yeah, good question. And I mean, it's particularly a very good question now that my research I'm doing at JCU, like I said, comes more from a development perspective. And I was discussing with someone the other day that I didn't speak very much Lao living in Laos, and they were an anthropologist, and they were quite shocked by that. So I suppose it's the different schools as well, that in an agricultural perspective, that wasn't necessarily what I was there to do. But I think it is a really difficult to put yourself within community if you're not able to communicate necessarily with the people that you're talking with. And I think I'm terrible at languages. So during my year and a half, I never really got enough fluency in Laos to really communicate that way. But something that I did learn is to sort of drop my guard down. So I think particularly being a new grad going into the role, I sort of thought I had to do everything perfectly and I had to be the best, and we were just going to run all these really good projects. And like I said, acknowledging that I was making mistakes, I think is the best way to do it, particularly in development, because you're never going to get it right. If we knew how to do development right, we wouldn't have to do it at all, because we would have fixed all of these global issues. And so I think there's a really sound benefit of just claiming that you've made a mistake. And I think that's actually where I got that communication and connection with my team members, because as Nora mentioned, culturally, they often don't necessarily want to tell you you're doing something wrong. So I'd say, should we run this project on this day and go to the field, for no other reason than I just selected that day. And everyone says yes. And then we go and there's a festival and you can't even get into the village. And everyone knew that, but no one wants to be offensive and say, oh, I don't think we should run it on this day. And so as soon as I started laughing, like in the beginning, I was stressed and annoyed by that because I wanted things to go perfectly. And then I'd laugh and be like, oh my goodness, look at us. Like, we shouldn't have done that. And then that really built that relationship with my team. So then by the end, and I was so proud the first time one of my team members said no to me, because I just sort of felt like that meant that we had a relationship. And so, which maybe wouldn't normally happen in a workplace, but I was so excited to have someone say no, because that meant we'd sort of built that relationship.
Yeah, almost like you were, waiting for someone to challenge you to see.
I was so excited.
Yeah. Nora, I have a question about forestry, particularly as I don't have very much experience in the forestry area. But how do you, if you're building plantations and developing the forestry industry, how does that conflict or you have to adapt when there is so much deforestation and land clearing and things like that happening? Is there a really difficult challenge when you're trying to promote forestry and other forestries are being pulled down? Is that difficult to work in that space?
Interesting question. Thank you. You can look at that from any number of ways. The forestry profession, I think, in some places and at some times has done a disservice by placing mostly exotic plantations in a landscape where people were drawing products they need from natural vegetation. On the other hand, I think globally now the estimates are somewhere between 1 to 2 billion hectares of former forest land requires restoration. And the number of people who are dependent on getting that forest back on the landscape is approaching, for direct dependence, is about 1.6 billion people. So it's a huge need to replace forest cover. And there are many ways of doing it. I happen to prefer, rather than reforestation, that is planting trees, I'm sort of a work with nature type, and I'd like restoration that involves fostering natural vegetation growth because of the diversity and the structural complexity and the ecological services, but also because that's what people know. Those are the resources that they know. Laos is really interesting, the range of forest resources. Edible insects is a really important part of household economy in some parts of Laos. And that's not a thing that I normally think of as a forest product, but it's an example of something that occurs in a natural system in pretty good abundance, but is rare in plantations. And so that's why I'm kind of closer to the natural forest end of the spectrum. In Laos also, there's a highly conflicted situation where local people have usufruct, that is the right to use land that they don't own. The land is in the public domain. At the same time that the government is assigning that same land to forestry companies for timber concessions to plant and harvest and so on. And there's a contradiction in the law. And part of the work of our policy project is trying to mediate that conflict in the law so that people can be looked after, but the country can also produce wood and build an economy. And there's a lot of challenges there.
Yeah, toing and froing, isn't it? That's development, isn't it? Yeah, always got to be weighing one against the other. So yeah, that's really interesting. I'd like to do one more question for both of you. Fran, we might start with you. Everyone, you've done an awesome job of talking about your career to date and your PhD. Where do you see yourself after your PhD? Do you see yourself still working in this agriculture for development, or have that slightly changed now?
Yeah, completely. I, to be honest, can't really see myself doing anything else. And I think one of the scary things, and what we were discussing earlier about COVID, is when I first went to Laos I found it challenging, as I mentioned. And then I suddenly just had like another aha moment, like I did when I wrote my literature review for my honours project. And I just thought, like, there is so much good that we can do in this space, and there's so much more we can do. And that's really where I'm now bridging those bonds between gender empowerment, development practice, and agriculture. Because I think sometimes while we work in agricultural development, there can sometimes be little shifts between each of those areas. And so I became probably too passionate about it, as you can see by the fact that I talk endlessly about it. But that's really where I found that passion. So that's why at the moment I'm doing 2 masters at the same time, because I'm doing one that's based particularly in agricultural development and another one that's based in development through a feminist lens, because I think I need to understand both facets of that. And then I want to sort of join them together for a PhD thesis. And then I just want to continue working in that space, really. And like I say, I'd love to see early retirement, because we've done enough to really improve development in ways that we can hand it totally over to local partners. Would be excellent.
Thanks, Fran. And Nora, do you see yourself developing some more projects in the forestry sector as we move towards, you know, this post-COVID world? And yeah, do you see different challenges that you want to target as you move forward?
Well, I think I mentioned that the ACIAR forestry portfolio has changed a lot. In the past, it was very focused on income, smallholder income, and now the agenda is a bit broader around broader suite of forest benefits. I have several new projects that have just been approved for funding that I'm going to be working on developing this year.
It's very exciting.
Yeah, it is. They're widely scattered. One is in Vanuatu, one is in Pakistan, one is in Indonesia. Yeah, it will be challenging. I think that, you know, the difference maybe between me and Fran, I'm close to the end of a career, and I'm thinking a lot about some of the threads that I've had earlier in my career that I want to pick up. I'm pretty keen on trying to train more people to do what I do. The skills around managing complex tropical forests are not very common, and they're not taught very much anymore. And I used to be a professor at a university, and I found that it's actually really gratifying. You sort of feel like you can multiply your contribution if you can foster other people who have skills and have the right, you know, people who want to make a contribution. And so I think I'm probably going to go back to doing a bit more teaching and training.
That's fantastic. And that's from a early career researcher as myself. It's very exciting to hear that someone with a wealth of knowledge is happy to then, you know, pass that knowledge on and build capacity, which is exciting. We need more people like yourself, Nora.
Well, the sad part is that my generation hasn't done a lot of the work that is very urgent. And, you know, we need reinforcements. We need people with guts and brains to step up and confront some of the challenges. I mean, climate change is the one that everybody, you know, it's a very topical thing, but there are many environmental threats and we need help. So
there's your call out, everyone. Start putting your thinking caps on. We've just ticked over to 1 o'clock there, guys. So thank you so much to Franny and Nora for your wealth of knowledge and experiences. I hope that it's encouraged a lot of you on the call today to maybe look at Southeast Asia and the opportunities that these countries have for research, and then maybe thinking about some of the challenges if you're already working in these areas that maybe you could use that Nora and Franny have talked about today. So like I said, this is one of our first of, we hope, 4 or 5 Spotlight On series. So if you keep an eye out on your emails and the RAID Facebook group, which is just for the RAID network. So jump onto Facebook, become part of that. And we'll focus on a different country next time. But if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Nora or Fran, please just get in contact with the events team and we can pass your questions on. Again, thanks to ACIAR and Crawford Fund. They're great sponsors of our RAID network, and it's a really great spot to go and have a look at different opportunities, particularly on the ACIAR website. Like Nora mentioned, there's lots of different portfolios where people could find an interest. And our RAID website's always updated with different opportunities as well. As a kind of conclusion to this first Southeast Asia webinar, we are going to send out a little pack that has some opportunities in Southeast Asia and maybe some of the challenges and yeah, just a different little thing that you can hold on to as being a part of our session today. So thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you at the next RAID event.
Thank you very much, Jess and RAID. It's great to be with you.
Thank you again, Nora. That's, yeah, it was really great.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jess and RAID. Awesome.